former Deputy National Security Advisor under President Obama, Ben Rhodes. I was going to say good morning, Ben, but it's really early morning for you in LA, so thank you for staying up. There's a consensus on this side of the Atlantic that Ukraine should get what Ukraine needs. Doesn't seem to be that way in Washington. Is that $60 billion package ever going to be shaken loose?
Well, I think, Trevor, right now it looks a little doubtful. And the irony is actually, I don't think that the public opinion in the United States differs that much from Europe. I think there's a majority of Americans who support Ukraine. I think there's a majority of members of Congress who would support this package. It's passed the United States Senate. It's stuck in the United States House of Representatives because you have a Speaker of the House who has to bring that legislation to the floor of the House for a vote, Mike Johnson. And he's now taking his cues completely from Donald Trump, who's the de facto leader of the Republican Party, the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party, and who, for his own ideological purposes and political purposes, has decided to draw a hard line against any assistance package being passed for Ukraine. And so as long as Trump is kind of pulling the strings in that party, it's going to be very hard to move that supplemental package through the House of Representatives.
That sounds like actually what you're saying is, unless Trump loses on November the 5th, that $60 billion is never going to see the light of day.
Yeah, I think in the coming weeks, there's going to be some effort to try to force a vote in the House, and there's some procedural ways in which you can try to go around the Speaker. It's very difficult to do that. I think, frankly, if the Speaker himself was worn down to allow a vote, he'd probably be ousted, just like the previous Republican Speaker was. So it's really our own chaos, which is largely tied to, obviously, the kind of Trump faction of the Republican Party. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one way to think about this is, look, I think the United States government can find other ways to try to get some support to the Ukrainians in the near term, probably not the full kind of 60 billion amount. We have other ways of moving around stockpiles and trying to get some arms on a short-term basis. But the reality is Ukraine is going to be on the ballot here, because everybody knows that if Donald Trump is elected president, that assistance is not being turned back on. And that, frankly, you're going to have a president who has expressed admiration for Vladimir Putin, a president who has not expressed the kind of support for Ukraine that we've seen from just about every other Western leader, and a president who says we should be spending money on our border and not defending allies, and frankly calls into question whether we should be in NATO at all. And so I frankly think that this is going to be on the ballot in the United States, and Vladimir Putin knows that too. He has every incentive to wait and see what happens in our election, and it's just another way in which our strange politics send out these ripples around the world, of course.
Could this be, I don't know quite how to put this, but let's put it this way, a Henry Kissinger realpolitik moment in which somebody has to say to the Ukrainians, actually, this is the best moment that you might experience over the next couple of years in terms of Western or American support. And maybe this is the moment where you need to sit down, talk to the Kremlin, make a deal, because it's all downhill from here.
The irony of that, Trevor, though, is that I think that Putin does not have an incentive to make a deal before election. If he thinks that there's a chance that Donald Trump getting back in the White House, why wouldn't he want to wait and see if he can have that advantage? So, yes, I think there is probably a greater openness to negotiation generally, because the war has such enormous cost and human cost, and there's such a fixed front line. And I'm sure what Putin would want is to essentially kind of freeze the conflict along that front line, which gains him more territory. That's something that President Zelensky has made clear that he cannot accept. So I don't see much of a window for negotiations here. And I think rather what's more likely to happen is that we're going to be looking at what happens after our election. And frankly, if Trump wins, I think a lot of the conversations that I've heard in Europe recently are about how much can Europe step up and fill some of the gap. It can't fill all of the gap that the United States has played thus far. And that's not the situation that I think any of us who support Ukraine would want to be in. But again, it just goes to the stakes in our election and globally in this kind of battle between more autocratic-minded leaders, including Donald Trump, and those that want to support democracies, including democracies like Ukraine, that are on the front lines.
Well, it looked like what happens in the United States could be the game changer. So let's go to that. There is some talk, I hear, of Biden trying to persuade Joe Biden to stand down, maybe trying to get his principal advisor, who I gather is Jill Biden, to say, look, it's time to go, and leaving it to the party convention in August to choose a candidate. Is there any chance at all, in your view, of that happening?
Well, I mean, look, I think it's really unlikely. As you said, we're past the stage when that can be done through voting, through the primary process. Joe Biden has expressed every intention of running. His kind of inner circle, who I knew from the Obama years, but not necessarily part of, though, they clearly feel committed to him running. He clearly thinks that he's the best candidate to take on Donald Trump. But look, we can't ignore the fact that he's a deeply unpopular president heading into a re-election. There are concerns, obviously, about his age. Those are hard concerns to address. It's not like a different kind of political problem that you can take on. I think the expectation, though, is that he'll be the nominee. Something pretty drastic would have to happen between now and the Democratic convention this summer for that to change. And again, the only place where that really could change is at that convention, where there are procedural ways to have a different nominee. But I think for now, the reality is we're looking at a Trump-Biden rematch. And so that's two politicians who have pretty significant vulnerabilities going up against each other. And one way to look at it, Trevor, is essentially if this election can become a referendum on Donald Trump, I think that benefits Joe Biden more. If this election is a referendum on Joe Biden, I think that benefits Donald Trump more. And that's the kind of election season that we're heading into.
Isn't it a great thing for democracy that it's going to be decided by voters choosing the candidate they least like and voting for the other guy?
I don't think it's the best thing, frankly. And, you don't see that kind of groundswell of enthusiasm that you even had, by the way, in the first Trump election. Trump is not as popular even as he was a few years ago. I mean, he swept this South Carolina primary, but he lost 40% of the vote. And a lot of those voters said that they don't even want to vote for Donald Trump, and they're Republicans. So it's not going to be a high enthusiasm election, but it's going to be a high stakes election. And like the last couple of American elections, it's going to come down to a few states. People tend to look at our national polls. Really, there's 4 or 5 states that are going to matter here because the country's so polarized that Biden and Trump are each going to kind of hold their terrain and just fight it out in a few places. And frankly, there's an enormous amount at stake, as we've been talking about, not just in the United States, but around the world, in terms of what a few tens of thousands of people decide to do in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and perhaps Arizona.
Ben, one of the things that we like on this program is to talk to people who've been in the room when it happened. Of course, you've been inside the White House, and I can't imagine the things that you've seen. But of course, one of the things that we wonder about here is what would a Trump White House 2.0 look like? Of course, you're an Obama guy, but if you could step back, what would you predict Trump Mark II would look like?
I think people around the world need to understand it'd be very different from Trump 1. I was in the White House when Trump won. We in the White House, our transition team, the people that are supposed to meet with the incoming president, met with the Trump team the next day after that election, and they had no plan. They didn't have the personnel picked out. They didn't have the policy, planning that they normally is done because they didn't think they were going to win. And then that whole transition team was fired and a different group of people was brought in. And then the first couple of years of the Trump presidency, he basically was surrounded by retired generals and Republican Party functionaries, not kind of ideological people. It took him a couple of years, Trevor, to figure out, wait a second, I can just kind of replace all these people with loyalists who will actually do what I want. And that's why by the end, by January 6th, you had a much more extreme group of people running the government for Donald Trump. And so the reality is that Trump 2.0 will be like that from day one. There will not be the retired generals. There will not be the Republican Party functionaries. There will be ideologues, and there will be people that have been planning for the last several years what their return would mean. And I think that's going to be a much more aggressive, vindictive, frankly, pugilistic Trump presidency. And I think that's why the stakes feel even higher, frankly, than his victory in 2016.
Ben, thanks for giving us something to look forward to. Thanks for your time this morning. Go get some sleep.
Thanks, Trevor.